Well, our protagonist, Victor Frankenstein, goes off to the University of Ingolstadt. But before he goes, an event occurs that is absolutely pivotal to the nature of the character and changes him for the worse. What happens here early on in chapter 2 is that his beloved Elizabeth catches scarlet fever. This is how he narrates the story. Elizabeth had caught the scarlet fever, but her illness was not severe and she quickly recovered. During her confinement, many arguments had been urged to persuade my mother to refrain from attending upon her. She had at first yielded to our entreaties, but when she heard that her favorite was recovering, she could no longer debar herself from her society and entered her chamber long before the danger of infection was past. The consequences of this imprudence were fatal. To understand the nature of this disease, we have to consider what scarlet fever really meant. It sounds very almost innocent to us now in an age of penicillin. The scarlet fever is essentially a type of virus that affects the body, and the fever shoots way up. We're talking over 100 degree temperatures, and the body gets covered with little pustules. It's a lot like chicken pox or measles, and is extremely deadly. People would die of it all the time because there was no medicine to stop the disease from rampaging through the body. So either you let the disease take its course and just run through the body and hoped you didn't die, or else, in the day and age of science at the time, you actually hasten the process by bloodletting. They would let blood out of a person, which made them weaker, and then they would die sooner. They didn't intend them to die, of course, but the medicine was so bad at the time that it actually caused death earlier than otherwise. One way or the other, this scarlet fever caused permanent scarring on the body, and sometimes people would have a flashback of the disease and contract minor versions of it further down the road. It was a very nasty little bit of disease. Well, his mother contracts the disease from Elizabeth, and his mother ends up dying. And consequently, in Victor's mind, the person of Elizabeth is permanently attached, in his mind, to the death of his mother. His mother, even on her deathbed, suggests that Elizabeth has to become has to take over her position. She says this: "On her deathbed, the fortitude and benignity of this admirable woman did not desert her. She joined the hands of Elizabeth and myself. 'My children,' she said, 'my firmest hopes of future happiness were placed on the prospect of your union. Elizabeth, my love, you must supply my place to your younger cousins.'" Then she dies, the mother dies, and it says she dies peacefully, and her countenance expressed affection even in death. But her mother says in front of Elizabeth and in front of Victor, "Elizabeth, you have to become me." So in Victor's mind, Elizabeth and his mother become like one and the same person. He begins to see in Elizabeth elements of his mother. And further on in the text, it even suggests that Elizabeth takes over this role very easily. It says this: "Elizabeth endeavored to renew the spirit of cheerfulness in our little society. Since the death of her aunt, her mind had acquired new firmness and vigor. She determined to fulfill her duties with the greatest exactness, and she felt that that most imperious duty of rendering her uncle and cousins happy had devolved upon her. She consoled me, amused her uncle, instructed my brothers, and I never beheld her so enchanting as at this time, when she was continually endeavoring to contribute to the happiness of others, entirely forgetful of herself." So again, in Victor's mind, Elizabeth and his mother become conflated into one person, so to speak. He falls in love with her, but falls in love with her somewhat because, strangely enough, he loved his mother so much. And mother died, and Elizabeth takes over that role. But the pain of losing his mother sticks with him for some time. And he says that it takes on a nuance as the event itself recedes into the past. He says that the brightness of a beloved eye can have been extinguished, and the sound of a voice so familiar and dear to the ear can be hushed, never more to be heard. These are the reflections of the first days, but when the lapse of time proves the reality of the evil, then the actual bitterness of grief commences. He describes the event of the death of his mother as bitter grief. And I think it's this bitter grief, especially this death in such a horrible way, that kind of prompts him to try and master the world. That's why I think Mary Shelley puts the death of the mother before his going off to Ingolstadt. He has a strong desire to master the world and to stop this kind of awfulness, losing one's mother, from happening to anybody else. He wants to put an end to death because it's so awful and horrible and bitter a thing, especially for him. Consequently, when he goes off to Ingolstadt, he intends to study something on the kin of magic, something like magic, but he's not sure quite what. And it's at Ingolstadt that he actually meets two professors that influence him in this direction. The first one, whose name is Monsieur Kremp, is a professor of natural philosophy. And Kremp he's a bit of an off-putting fellow. He's described in the following way. M. Kremp was a little squat man with a gruff voice and repulsive countenance. The teacher therefore did not prepossess me in favor of his doctrine. When he presents to Kremp, too, the idea that he has studied Paracelsus and Cornelius Agrippa Kremp is immediately insulting to those men and saying, oh, they're terrible, how you waste your time on such garbage. He says, have you really spent your time in studying such nonsense? I replied in the affirmative. Every minute, continued Monsieur Kremp with warmth, every instant that you have wasted on those books is utterly and entirely lost. You have burdened your memory with exploded systems and useless names. Good God, in what desert land have you lived, where no one was kind enough to inform you that these fancies which you have so greedily imbibed are 1,000 years old, and as musty as they are ancient? I little expected in this enlightened and scientific age to find a disciple of Albertus Magnus and Paracelsus. My dear sir, you must begin your studies entirely anew. So Kremp is squat, and he's short, he's obnoxious, and he's annoying. He's kind of off-putting to Victor. But Victor also meets his companion, Kremp's companion, named Monsieur Waldman. Kremp and Waldman are like Mutt and Jeff. They're like a team almost. They're like the two brothers in the House of Mystery. They are complementary. They're like Cain and Abel, you could say. They are almost twins in what their role is, but they're very different in how they look. So here's the description of Monsieur Waldman. This professor was very unlike his colleague. He appeared about 50 years of age, but with an aspect expressive of the greatest benevolence. A few gray hairs covered his temples, but those at the back of his head were nearly black. His person was short but remarkably erect, and his voice the sweetest I have ever heard. Further on, when Monsieur Waldman hears about his Paracelsus and Albertus Magnus, he has a very different reaction. It's dismissive, but it's not obnoxious the way that Kremp is. So he says this, Waldman heard with attention my little narration concerning my studies, and smiled at the names of Cornelius, Agrippa, and Paracelsus, but without the contempt that Monsieur Kremp had exhibited, and he said that these were men to whose indefatigable zeal modern philosophers were indebted for most of the foundations of their knowledge. They are left to us as an easier task to give new names and arrange in connected classifications the facts which they in a great degree had been the instruments of bringing to light. The labors of men of genius, however erroneously directed, scarcely ever fail in ultimately turning to the solid advantage of mankind. Waldman's reaction is very encouraging to Victor, and his earlier dislike of natural philosophy gets converted. See, earlier he had been objecting to natural philosophy as something that was rather grubby. It was kind of disgusting. It was beneath him. It wasn't high and lofty the way that Paracelsus and Cornelius Agrippa were lofty and exalted. And he even points this out quite directly when, after meeting Monsieur Kremp, he has this to say about natural philosophy. I had a contempt for the uses of modern natural philosophy. It was a very different when the masters of the science sought immortality and power. Such views, although futile, were grand. But now the scene was changed. The ambition of the inquirer seemed to limit itself to the annihilation of those visions on which my interest in science was chiefly founded. I was required to exchange chimeras of boundless grandeur for realities of little worth. He doesn't really want to give up his visions that Cornelius Agrippa and Paracelsus grant him because they were boundless grandeur. They were beautiful. It's like standing on a mountain or on a glacier looking out over this vast vista, this beautiful sea, this almost gorgeous thing that was created by these philosophers. And what natural philosophy seems to suggest is that you have to look at things on a very grubby, microscopic kind of base, low level. You have to get your hands dirty. You have to see the world as a machine within a machine, and it's disgusting, it's base. Notice that with the comparison between the high and lofty versus the low and grubby, you've got a sort of a twin positions. They work in unison in a way. Just as Monsieur Waldman and Monsieur Kremp are like twins, the high and lofty and the low and grubby. And both of them embody the vision, the difference of vision between Paracelsus and the modern natural philosophers. But even Waldman says that the natural philosophers are beholden to Paracelsus and Agrippa. Paracelsus and Agrippa started all this. The natural philosophers owe them a debt, but only natural philosophy provides results, as he says in the speech that he gives to his class. The ancient teachers of this science promised impossibilities and performed nothing. The modern masters promise very little. They know the metals cannot be transmuted, and that the elixir of life is a chimera, but these philosophers whose hands seem only made to dabble in dirt, and their eyes to pore over the microscope or crucible, have indeed performed miracles. Waldman's whole point here is that the grubbiness, the lowness, the seeing the world as a machine within a machine that natural philosophy asks a student to do is itself, it's grubby, it's dirty, it makes your hands all filled with grime, but it produces results. Paracelsus and Cornelius Agrippa promised great things and beautiful things, but they had no results at all. Nothing came of what they promised. If you took this as a sort of metaphor for the difference between one vision and the next, the vision of the world as beautiful and glorious and lovely, Mary Shelley seems to be saying, is indeed noble, but it produces nothing. It doesn't allow you to master the world or overcome disease or change your government. Whereas on the other hand, it may seem that looking at the world as a machine within a machine is grubby and base and horrible and disgusting, but it allows you to change the world. You can alter the gene, you can create penicillin, you can create a new government, you can alter the means of warfare, and so the one, lofty and beautiful, doesn't yield anything. The other, base and grubby, produces a great deal, produces a lot of results. And it's this very thing that prompts Victor to enter into natural philosophy, predominantly in chemistry. And that will produce, later on, the disastrous results that we see in the rest of the novel.